So hello guys, welcome to the Improvement Season podcast. It has been a while for us at least. For me personally, I was on holiday like last week. So Steve and I recorded an episode 2 weeks ago. So it feels like always like a lifetime ago ever since we are recording an episode. And this time it's not Steve that I have on the other end. It is Mike. And Mike, I don't know, have you ever done an episode just the two of us?
We have never done this before. I think we did like a coaching corner podcast where it
Yeah.
was you, me, and maybe like Harry or Jess, but
Yeah.
never just solely us two. So this is a first.
Perfect. First and foremost, how are you, Mike? How's the post prep period going? I mean, it has been a while ever since, but how are things?
Yeah, no, it's going great actually, and just still in a very nice phase at the moment where, you know, strength and performance is continuing to improve, and it's just a really nice period. Like, also, you're still that little bit lean and you're not kind of absolute peak mass. So again, it's a really nice time where you're not like super hot or super heavy kind of thing. Just a really kind of nice period at the moment.
Yeah, was it hard for you to actually transition out of it? Because sometimes people have it that they are gaining weight too fast because of the things that you've just mentioned. You still look good. You look even much fuller. And because of this, you're then accepting when the scale weight is actually moving up much faster, and you are justifying when you're then in a massive caloric surplus and you think like, hey, I'm still looking good, so I can keep on being more aggressive. And then all of a sudden, the day comes when you're just looking soft.
And do you know what? Actually, surprisingly, I didn't struggle with it as much as I thought I might do. And I think that was for a couple of reasons. I think, firstly, I've been working with Steve now and for since 2019. So that's maybe 6 years. So I think having worked with him for so long, I've just built up a lot of good habits. And I think some of the probably mindsets and thoughts that weren't helpful I've been able to sort of improve upon and kind of have strategies in place. And I think also, and I think that goes to just the saying of actually it really pays off to make sure that you're kind of almost being coached, or you're spending time before you compete or before you get really lean to get good strategies in place. But also it coincided with the release of the paper by Eric Helms about not needing to go into a large calorie surplus. And I think there was a lot of information going around in terms of, the recovery diet, and a lot of kind of information about how to successfully navigate a post-show period. So I think there was that as well. And then also I did spend kind of just time, sort of reflecting on my thoughts and reflecting the season and those sorts of things. And I think a culmination of all those sorts of things really just helped to sort of manage me coming out of that period for sure.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it seems like it was the perfect timing for you to actually go through that period with then, just like you mentioned, the paper coming out and also having built that rapport together with Steve. And I see it all the time also with athletes. The longer that you've been working for, the better you can set someone up for the entire season, but then also the post-show period. And it's always unfortunate when you have someone leaving right after them the last show, because you would love to actually then support them through the post-show period as well. Some people manage it quite well on their own. You always have those people. And I think that the vast majority of people think that they are these type of people who can manage it. But from my personal experience, most people are then actually going down, especially when it's the first time that they're competing or the second time that they're competing. They didn't really have the best relationship with food prior to that already. It's just often a recipe for disaster afterwards.
Oh, I totally agree. And I think it's the same for all of us, where sometimes you just can't see out of your own perspective. Like, you might think, oh, I have good habits, or, I've got good strategies, or like you said, I can cope with it. But in reality, there's a few weak spots or blind spots that you're not aware of, that something like a challenge, like a competition season, reveals. And I think that's only where, having a coach and actually being with that coach before and after, is really critical for sure. And I think that's also where the difference between, say, a first-time competitor and someone who's done multiple seasons, like a Jeff Alberts, they they would have made mistakes, but then they would have learned from him and they would have done something differently next time. So yeah, I completely agree, for sure.
No, absolutely. So Mike, you're now here on the podcast with me alone. So I thought that I'm going to abuse this now for my own benefits. And that is, you know me. Mike, you know me. I have been dealing with several injuries and I'm a wreck when it comes to my body. And the thing is that I've come more to realize now, because last week I was on a winter holiday. So the unfortunate thing is I'm normally a snowboarder. So coming down first slope, and I realized my hip doesn't really play along anymore, which is very unfortunate. So I switched over to skiing, which worked out quite nicely though. But I think it's 2 years ago when I even competed, and we were over and training together at Steve's place, I think it was. I already told you, like, I have always kind of a stinging sensation on the lateral part of my knee, the left side, which may then be connected also with my hip injury that I've suffered from like ages ago already. And I have to admit that I'm quite immobile when it comes to unspecific things. When it comes to lifting, I can easily go down into a squat position quite nicely. When it comes to the mobility around benching, for example, no issues whatsoever. But outside of that, everything that is unspecific to lifting, I've realized that I'm very much not fit in the sense of like agile, flexible, and I thought that I need to change something about it. And that's why I would love to discuss everything around stretching with you, because I think that there are many misconceptions, and especially when you're trying to look things up on the internet, you don't really find any reliable sources as a novice when it comes to that field, or as someone who doesn't really know anything about stretching. You find something like what is it again? WebDM or what?
WebMD.
WebMD, exactly, or kind of, I don't know, WikiHow and all that kind of jazz, right? But I want to actually find something that is specific, more specific to also then the world of lifting, just being an athlete and just trying to move better again. So, I hope that's all right with you, so that I'm going to pick your brain and your expertise around stretching. Let's start off with what exactly is stretching itself? What happens structurally? And what is the intent behind it? And then we can actually then take it down that road afterwards.
Absolutely. So stretching, you're essentially elongating the tissues. You're putting the muscles and the tissues at their fully lengthened range. Every muscle, if you were to break it down, you've not only got a muscle fiber, you've got these things called myofibrils, which are like tiny little threads within a fiber. So a fiber is like a bundle. You have what's called like a fascicle, which is inside the fiber. And then you've got kind of filaments within that as well. And within those filaments, they literally kind of, people would only be able to see this on the YouTube, but those filaments kind of go back and forth. They slide over one another with these kind of proteins that they're made up of. And essentially, when you're stretching and when you're performing a movement, those filaments are essentially either going to their fully kind of lengthened position where they're kind of, essentially at their maximum length, essentially. Now, it's not just that simple. So within ligaments, within muscles, we all have these receptors which provide sensory information as to where our joints are in space, the length of the tissues, stretch sensations, and all manner of different things. So typically what happens when we are stretching, there are these things called Golgi tendon organs, which primarily exist within the ligaments of joints, and they are one of the primary receptors that really kind of sense stretch. And often that's when you say bend down to touch your toes, you go, oh, my hamstrings kind of thing. And those are those Golgi tendon organs, and that will kind of stop you. But then if you hold that stretch for like say 10 seconds, you kind of find that actually you can sink in a little bit deeper. And that is those Golgi tendon organs getting used to that position and then kind of essentially relaxing everything a little bit so you can sink into the stretch a little bit deeper. And muscle spindles, probably to a lesser degree. Again, these are receptors that exist within the actual muscle itself, but they can be a little bit sensitive to kind of stretch sensations as well. So all of these things we're stimulating when we are stretching. Now, obviously, if we were to just stretch one off for one time only, we're probably not stimulating any adaptations. But then over time, if we were to progressively stretch or to do lengthened movements, then again, we're causing structural adaptations that are then kind of changing the structure and changing kind of the perception of what the information those receptors are kind of picking up. So that's a lot of information so far, but is that kind of making sense?
It makes a lot of sense. So basically you're causing a stimulus and the body needs to adapt to it once again. In the initial short term, it happens due to those trigger mechanisms.
Yes.
And it releases something so that you can actually get a greater range of motion.
Correct. And that is the key difference between something like foam rolling, where you're just activating, you're having essentially a neural effect, is what we know. So you're having that kind of neural effect, and you get a very acute change that only lasts for a short period of time. Whereas if you were to stretch or perform a lengthened movement over a long period of time, and again, that would be slightly different. But if you were to do foam rolling over a long period of time, there isn't really, I don't think to my knowledge, any evidence to show that long-term chronic foam rolling causes long-term adaptations to the tissues. It changes what we call pain pressure thresholds, which is basically your perception of soreness, pain, etc. But apart from that, apart from stimulating receptors, it doesn't really I don't think the evidence is very strong on anything else that it kind of performs, but that's a slight side tangent.
And on that note, though, do you think that there may be potentially a synergistic effect of using foam rolling in combination with then stretching?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is more user specific as well. So if you've got someone who's been foam rolling for a long time, then actually it's probably going to be more useful for them than it is for someone who's never foam rolled before. So, a common example might be, if you were to, it's a bit of a funny example, but, if you were to get your mother, for example, or your grandmother to do foam rolling for the first time, they would hate it because one, it would be awkward, and two, they'd find it horrendously painful. And any of us who remember our first time experience of foam rolling, it's horrendous. But after a while, you get used to it. So for someone who's never used it before, it's probably a disadvantage because of, technique and all of those things. But for someone who's more accustomed to it, it's definitely going to have more benefits. And because of those acute changes that it can occur in the short term, it can allow you to access positions and get into those positions a little bit more easily. So it can definitely have a synergistic effect in the short term for sure.
So if you were to then practically apply it, would you then recommend to have a little bit of a foam rolling session prior to stretching?
I wouldn't say, to be honest, if I was talking to you in the clinic right now, I would again be very sort of on the fence. I would say if you were the type of person that came to me and said, do you know what, Mike, I really enjoy foam. I find foam rolling really beneficial. I'd be like, sure, definitely. But if you were kind of someone who were like, a bit, nah, I don't foam roll normally, I would say, do you know what, you probably don't need it. I would probably say, you are probably going to get just as much benefit from maybe going on the bike for 5 minutes. And they've done this research, by the way, where they've compared foam rolling and stretching with bike and mobility, and they had the same outcomes. So again, I would say for someone who's not too bothered about it or who doesn't normally foam roll on a regular basis, I'd probably say don't worry too much about it. But then also, conversely, because also we've got to take into account the placebo effect and people's expectations, so which is really valid, absolutely. So if someone has got that history and that kind of bias, for want of a better word, of they like foam rolling, I'm like, yeah, definitely include it in there. But if not, I kind of go with that a little bit.
And what if, so let's take me as an example, right? Just to describe my symptoms so that other people may also relate to that, and also so that you can give a little bit more of a specific advice in a situation like this so that people have an understanding of the process of going through that and what it is that you would recommend. So my hip has been, so I went through a hip surgery back in 2016. They fixed the FAI, so the femoral acetabular impingement. And ever since then, still, my range of motion is limited due to it having been worked on, of course, right? Now, over the past couple of months and years, I have developed a little bit more of a stinging sensation that even goes all the way into my glutes, which then, if I then move around in a specific position, so especially like the hip flexor stretch kind of, I get a stinging sensation even in my glutes. And that goes all the way down then to the lateral part of my knee. And I have the inclination that it has to do with the piriformis. And if it's then a deeper kind of muscle tissue that is very hard even to stretch with the piriformis, and also my current hip situation, it's very hard to get into those positions to really get a proper stretch on the piriformis. And maybe then by that, lengthen it and get a little bit of a relief that is then pressing on the nerve. What would you then recommend in a situation like this?
So I would first maybe... I think we've got to backtrack a little bit in terms of if the piriformis, so the piriformis is part of a group of muscles that externally rotate your hip. So if someone was to look at an anatomy chart, you would obviously, the superficial muscles that you see first are obviously your glutes, which we all know about. But if you were to cut them away, you then find these very small, deeper muscles which fan from the outside of your femur, your greater trochanteric, onto the sacrum. Now, and so that your piriformis is one of them, and it's probably one of the larger ones, but they externally rotate the hip. Now, what they are often and being more commonly referred to are the rotator cuff of the hip. And even though they play a slightly smaller role, it's still an important role in providing some control and stability of the hip. So coming on to something else is like, okay, well, if your piriformis or the muscles around there, if they're tight, why are they tight? We confuse tightness with a lack of flexibility, but they're tightness for a reason. Now, muscles get tight because either they're not strong enough, they're being overloaded and mechanically disadvantaged. Maybe there's some systemic illness, maybe there's a neurological disorder, and there's other reasons as well. Those sorts of reasons cause tightness. If a muscle is short just because it's not used to a certain movement, that's actually far less common, I would say. So, okay, you've got a tight piriformis. Why is it tight? Is it because it's weak, stemming from the surgery? Potentially. So would we benefit from stretching the piriformis? Short term, it would give you some relief, and there's nothing wrong with that. But actually, the long-term solution could be do we need to actually strengthen instead of stretching the piriformis for a better long-term solution? And that kind of also ties in with the fact that the hip is incredibly complex. It's the absolute kind of junction between kind of your lower extremity and the upper extremity. You get a lot of transfer of forces. You've got a lot of muscles intersecting that area. So it's a very complex area that requires stability. So again, like sometimes when you've got one thing that is slightly off, it affects a lot of other things. So if I was kind of with you in the clinic, I would kind of want to assess what is the strength of the piriformis like and potentially go there. Because another thing, when we're talking about stretching, we talk about stretching in the context of range of movement, but static stretching is not the only way to improve range of movement. We know this. We know through, people doing lengthened partials, people doing training through their full range of movement, that you can actually increase your range of movement. We know this through the case of Steve, where he's been doing SLDLs for a very long time, and actually he can now do barbell SLDLs with a deficit, whereas he couldn't before. So, sorry, I've been talking a lot, but do you have any kind of thoughts on what I just said?
No, absolutely. And I think that you've covered and touched on many things that I wanted to go down in regards to the avenue here. And then first and foremost is you brought up one thing, and that is figuring out what the culprit is. How do we go about it though? How do you know what the culprit is, and what do you look for?
And it's also, it's a process of elimination, I think. So for me, it's always about starting in one place and assessing, okay, is that doing its job? And if it is, cool, we move on to a different area. So for me, I always like to start around kind of like that pelvis area. Does someone have good hip extension strength? Do they have good hip flexor strength, abduction, adduction, external rotation? If that's kind of key, I might look further down. Again, you've got kind of, I think, history as well of things like ankle sprains and so on. So again, it's important we take that into account as well. So it is a little bit of a process of elimination, and you're just going through kind of different areas, segments of the body. Is it doing its job? If it's not, okay, we go from there and we tick that off the box and go from there.
And what does this process look like in regards to the length? Is it like a process that can be ruled out in a matter of like a couple of days, a couple of weeks, or actually then a process of months and even years?
Yeah, so I think that kind of depends a little bit. So I think obviously if you're working with someone, so if you're working with a coach, with a physio, doctor, etc., particularly kind of someone who's quite experienced, I would say that process will inevitably be a lot shorter than if you were just on your own trying to figure it out yourself, of course. But then I think if you said, right, I think some of these symptoms are related to the strength of a muscle or a particular movement pattern, then that might be a slightly longer process depending on how long it takes to improve. So it's a bit of a depends question, that I think sometimes it can be shorter, sometimes it might take a little bit longer, but I think it's just about understanding that process a little bit and accepting like, okay, depending on what we're trying to work on, it could be a little bit longer.
And in that regard as well, then, when you're saying that it is a more complex thing where you're then trying to rule out certain things, how do you then know whether something was actually beneficial or not? Especially because if there can be several things playing into it, sometimes I would assume the biofeedback that is being provided by your body may even be misleading, doesn't it?
Sometimes it can, but very often, sometimes I find it's accurate, because sometimes you might have had the situation where something has intuitively felt right. You do it and you're like, I just feel better by having done this. And I think the body, sometimes the body is smarter than we are, than kind of what we think. And I think something will naturally kind of feel better. And I think when you essentially, all physio health practitioners, we're just someone who's asking a question to the body, and then the body is going to kind of give us an answer. And sometimes it might be, no, I don't like this. And so maybe the pain gets worse, maybe the movement pattern gets worse, there's less range of movement. Okay, that's still an answer. And so we just need to know that that wasn't the answer we were looking for. So we're going to go down a different track. So I think, just on a slight side note, sometimes even if someone has increased pain after doing something, whether that's an exercise or a particular, kind of tactic, it's still useful information. It's like, Thomas Edison, when he was inventing the light bulb and he failed, it's like, that wasn't a failure. I now know like 9,099 ways how to not make a light bulb, kind of thing. So there's that kind of side of things. But then, yes, but when you ask a question, so I've sometimes had it where someone with back pain, I've mobilized their foot and they've felt better. And I think it's sometimes like, actually, you will get that positive and good response sometimes.
No, that is very interesting, to be honest. And it just once again shows how clueless I am when it comes to those mobility things. Because I think a lot of listeners are probably like that as well. The typical bros, meatheads that do go to the gym 5 to 6 times per week, but outside of that, don't really follow any kind of other physical activity, even if it's kind of mobility drills and flexibility and all that kind of stuff. And then it's just a gradual process of then getting older as well. And then all of a sudden you're running into issues. And you just think like, how can I fix this? Because this is where I'm at right now. Over years, I was always questioning like, how can I fix this? But it wasn't really as acute, where I thought like, I need to really now commit to, I don't know, a mobility routine, really committing to taking care of that. But after the skiing holiday now, I got to the point where I thought like, this can't be how I'm now progressing forward. I need to actually fix it now so that it doesn't really become a massive issue later down the line. And what I would then like to know is, because you brought up something about kind of biofeedback and pain, is it sometimes even good to experience some kind of discomfort if you're going through kind of mobility routines, or do you always want to avoid any kind of negative feedback in the sense of like pain or discomfort? Or is it that you need to sometimes go into those tissues in order to maybe release something?
So this is it's probably more of a nuanced question than people realize, because as we know, pain is very subjective, and pain has different connotations in between people, cultures, etc. For me, discomfort could mean something totally different to someone else. So what I would say is, if we're talking about, I would kind of describe pain as a very kind of sharp, acute feeling, whereas versus say soreness or like a discomfort from. So again, I think most of us would have that sensation when you kind of stretch and it's uncomfortable, but it's not painful, if you know what I mean.
Can I give you a little bit more context when it comes to my situation? And I don't want the audience to get a wrong idea that it's just about me, but I think that many people are experiencing something in their shoulders, maybe in their hips, in their low back, in their knees. These are the common places where many people are then struggling with certain things, and maybe it's something that they went through as well, or that they've experienced. So I started to do several kind of mobility routines with from Tom Merrick over on YouTube.
Bodyweight Warrior.
Exactly. And I do enjoy those because I have the feeling that shortly after, I always feel a little bit better. And I've just recently started, so I can't really expect to see massive changes since like a week, especially if I've dealt with this kind of immobility since I was born, basically. I never really did any kind of huge mobility drills. And whenever I'm going into, for example, a lunge position, specifically with my hip, it is as if I have like a blockage there. I'm going into hip extension, basically, and I feel as if something is there that is blocking me and actually going any kind of further. It is not causing sharp pain where I'm saying like I can't really hold that position, but it's like a dull pressure, more so feeling around the hip socket, hip joint. Is that something that you would say is a cause for concern, where you would say like don't go there, or would you even recommend like, okay, this is exactly what it is that we are looking for, go in there and try to actually loosen things up?
No, so I would say if there is a block to movement, I would say don't push through that. I typically say kind of, if you go into a position and it's kind of you can't go any further without pain, then I would say stay there for a little while. And then if your body loosens up a little bit and you can ease into it a little bit more, do that. But don't force through movement blocks in particular, because otherwise, typically what I've found is either the body is just going to fight against you, because it's not, the body will give you range of movement essentially if it trusts you and it thinks it's safe. If it senses instability in an area, it will lock that area down in a way to protect the body. Now, if you force through that, your body is going to do one of two things. It's either going to just clamp down on it even more, if you're trying to steal a stick from a dog's mouth and you're just trying to grab it, it's just going to clamp down tighter, kind of thing. Or again, if you push through, then again you could potentially just cause injury or just cause more pain. So I wouldn't push through an actual blocked movement. Again, the body will tell you if it's willing and able to go a little bit further, for sure.
And what if you're so immobile that it is an utter joke of your range of motion that you can accomplish?
So I think it's about playing the long game. So again, like if you wanted to squat 200 kilos, it doesn't matter how much you want to squat 200 kilos, you can't go from 50 to 200 in a day. I would also say utilize other strategies. So again, if you're trying to squat 200 kilos, yes, you could just practice the squat, but then you can also do accessory movements. You can practice kind of box squats, etc. You can break it down. Now, when it comes to kind of the mobility component, what you could do is you could maybe try other movements. You could maybe try other forms of mobility. So maybe weighted stretching. Maybe you could do more kind of dynamic stretching, lengthen partials, etc. So I think it's about, in that moment, not necessarily forcing it. I think you can only make that call whether to push more unless you've got a teacher or a coach in the room with you, who can give you that feedback and you've got a bit more experience. But otherwise I would say don't push through it. Just maybe see if you can find other ways of improving it over time.
Do you not see the progress you would like? Are you sick of writing your own programs? Or perhaps you need some accountability in order to stick with a plan? Then it's time to start working with us. We at Revive Stronger offer a truly personalized coaching service. You'll get more than just an email with some macros or random cookie cutter program. With Revive Stronger, you will be the center of our attention. You will receive your own fully individualized training protocol alongside a customized nutritional strategy. We create the coaching around your needs, wants, personal preferences, and your own unique lifestyle. Every single week, we delve into your program in order to make appropriate adjustments so that we get the most out of your time and the best possible outcome. We help both female and male athletes to seriously change their body composition by adding more muscle mass and decreasing fat tissue. No matter if you're a competitive bodybuilder or just want to look better, if you need help with your progress and taking your physique to the next level, our coaching is for you. It's time to make a change. Sign up today and let's revive stronger.
And is there a reason for people to then be concerned about whenever they are feeling a little bit of discomfort, right? Because I don't want to create any kind of fear mongering so that people are at the slightest form of discomfort being put off by actually then going into that range of motion that is beneficial.
Yeah, so I would often use a bit of a traffic light kind of system where I say, if it's kind of like, 0 to 3 out of 10, in terms of discomfort, then I would say keep going, keep doing it. If it's like a 3 to 5 out of 10, it's probably like an amber light where I'd say, keep going, but, just kind of stay at that level kind of thing, or maybe even just back off a tiny little bit. And if it's 5 out of 10 or above, this, like in terms of pain or discomfort, I'd probably say just ease off, back off of that a little bit, stop. And particularly if you feel worse, a few hours later or the next morning, again, that's probably just a sign that your body wasn't quite ready for that amount or intensity of work. And what people sometimes don't realize is that static stretching can be really intense. If you look at some of the intense, static stretches gymnasts do, that is actually putting a big, load on the body actually. And what sometimes people don't realize is you can get sore from static stretching, particularly if you go hard. So I think sometimes people have got to, if you're going to be doing a hard static stretching session, then make sure you still need to give your tissues time to recover for sure.
That brings me exactly to the next point that I wanted to ask, Mike. How much is too much when you're working on trying to improve, for example, the mobility, or working on something to actually then improve in terms of your injury? Is there a too much? How often do you want to actually then follow a protocol? Because right now I'm doing it twice daily for like 15 minutes. And I don't know whether you can actually go up to the point where it's kind of like a bell-shaped curve, where you can actually then see rapid improvements if you just find the time for it, and then it just quickly declines. And where's kind of the sweet spot in your personal experience?
So I think it kind of analogous to training. I think it depends on more that weekly volume almost. So I think kind of what they found is that probably a good starting point is at least kind of like 5 total minutes of stretching per week. That is like your starting point.
Yeah, overshot that starting point by a lot though.
Yeah, exactly. But this is what people do. They kind of they do more than they think they actually need. When in reality, if you're someone who's maybe not stretched much in the past, then then you probably don't need as much as you think you do. So again, up to I think anywhere from a minute and a half to 3 minutes, kind of over like starting off 2 to 3 times per week. that would probably be enough. And I think, again, but you've probably got to, that is going to your stretching limit, your maximum sort of range of movement, and holding it there for, and being in that position for that 1.5 to 3 minutes, 2 to 3 times a week. That's what the literature says at the very least. And then obviously what you want to do is you want to, just like you would in training, you'd want to gradually build that up. Or even if you just stayed with a similar time, but you improved like your depth or your kind of your range of movement and just got into the stretches a little bit deeper, then that's perfectly sufficient as well.
And when we're just drawing the comparison to training volume, for example, is there a dose-response relationship between kind of stretching or mobility work and then also the improvements up to a certain extent? So also there a bell-shaped curve, right? Up to a certain amount, it's kind of an exponential rise. And then the more you do, the more it flattens out up to the point where it's actually then being detrimental.
Exactly. And again, you've got to know, you've kind of got to know who you are as a person, because you will have people who are hypermobile, and actually stretching for them, you really don't, they don't want to be, you don't want to be stretching. And it almost gets to a point where, like you said, almost doing too much is detrimental, even in the sense of it's impacting other areas, because you're stretching so much is impacting your recovery and your performance in your other training sessions, or it's making you kind of what I would call lax, where you've kind of got this range of movement, but you don't have the control and the strength in that newfound range of movement. So it's like you said, it's kind of making sure you're not doing too much, and you're balancing that out. And I think you will probably get to a point where either you've got the necessary range of movement to now utilize in your day-to-day life and in the activities that you want, and so you can just call it there and you can just kind of back off a little bit, just do some maintenance work, and that's absolutely fine. Or again, you might not be there quite yet and you might just need to kind of do a little bit more. But that doesn't always necessarily mean, again, you don't necessarily have to just do more stretching for longer. It could just be actually you're just getting into the stretch just a little bit deeper. Again, it's kind of just pick your poison. Do you want to go with kind of like frequency, or do you want to actually go with, less frequency, but you're just going a little bit harder, a little bit deeper in the actual session itself?
That makes a lot of sense. And a question that then pops to my mind is, does the structure that you're working on also need a recovery period in order to undergo some adaptations, or is that not kind of similar to something like training, for example?
Oh, no, I think you can definitely draw that comparison. So I think if you were to, I can't think of another expression, but if you weren't to stretch, if you weren't to stretch to the degree that it would cause an adaptation. So let's just say, you feel a tiny bit of a stretch, but it's not sort of uncomfortable, or it's not discomfort, or it's not at your kind of current limit, you're probably not doing enough to stimulate an adaptation. So again, if people remember kind of Eric Helms, when he did that kind of calf experiment where he wore that kind of stretching device, he had to do it to, I think it was maybe 7 or 8 out of 10. So again, like, I think you need to make sure that when you're doing the stretching, that you're doing it with intention and with purpose, and that's probably likely to cause an adaptation. So I think as long as you're doing that, then I think that's the key thing. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the other part of your question.
No, it was about adaptations and whether you need also some time in between instead of just going for it. Because for me personally, I'm working from at home, right? I can easily fit it into my day. Sometimes I would even, because I'm sitting most of the time throughout the day, I would even think that it's beneficial to just go in between a break, do some mobility drills, and do it on such a high frequency that perhaps it is even counterproductive for some of my connective tissues, especially like the knee and also then the hips joint.
Yeah, sorry, and that's great, because and I think if you're in that specific situation as you're in, I think that's absolutely perfect. But someone who might not be able to do that because maybe they work in an office and they've got a very kind of demanding kind of work life where they can't take that break, it might be actually, well, okay, maybe they just allocate like an hour in the morning or an hour in the evening outside of that kind of training window to kind of specifically work on that. And I think it's important that if it's static stretching in particular, where you're holding static stretches for a long period of time, I would try to separate it from kind of training a little bit. You could do it afterwards. I think they have shown in the research now that, again, there was a big thing, a while ago where, static stretching was really demonized prior to like a max lift, because they felt that would take away from your ability to produce force and maximal output. But we now know that actually, even if you were to kind of, do a little bit of static stretching beforehand and then maybe do some more dynamic mobility work, it doesn't have any detrimental effects at all. And particularly for bodybuilding as well, it probably matters less where you're not necessarily doing a 1 rep max squat type thing. But I would still say, again, because if you are really purposely stretching quite hard, I would probably still say it's a little bit more advantageous to do that maybe at a different time of the day or on a different day potentially.
No, absolutely. In a more complex case, how long would you expect it to see at least some kind of improvements? And if there aren't any kind of improvements that someone can look out for, what would then be the next step? Would it be seeking out some professional help, et cetera, et cetera? Because I would very much assume many people who are listening are from the UK or the US. Many people can't just go to the physio because it's, of course, for some people expensive, right? So, of course, most people would start trying to fix things and solve things on their own. But once again, how long would you wait in order then before seeking out some professional help?
So I would probably say give it 6 weeks. That's a bit of a kind of magic number. Now, what you've got to remember is, just like with training, you're going to get probably 2 types of adaptations. You're going to get neural adaptations and you're going to get structural adaptations. Now, I don't think they've not really done a lot of long-term follow-up studies where they've kind of assessed static stretching. I think it's only been up to kind of 6 weeks or sort of a few months. You have noticed a little bit of change over that 6-week period. So I would say, I would give yourself at least that kind of 6-week window. And then if it's not improving, that's when I would, seek other help. And it comes also back to what we were talking about earlier about, do you know what? It might not be improving because, if the body senses there is instability, it will not give you more range of movement. So again, it comes back to actually, are we addressing a symptom and not the root cause? And again, sometimes you just might need someone else with an external eye to help give you that insight.
If you're in a situation where you have like a fucked up joint, let's say it's a shoulder joint or even the hip joint, is there at some point no other way instead of kind of surgery? Because I do remember the time back in 2015, for example, where I was then contemplating and going through surgery. And I was, of course, trying to avoid this. And I found this YouTube channel back then, who then, now looking back in hindsight, I should have been more skeptical about this, but they were claiming like, okay, you can actually work around something like FAI if you're going through some kind of mobility drills and all that kind of stuff. And even now, it sounds plausible to someone like me, because if you are more mobile, then the hip joint can move a little bit more freely up to the point where then, of course, there's bone-to-bone contact. But of course, in itself, it kind of moves a little bit more freely, and it makes sense. What's your take on this?
So it's really interesting. So the body is extremely adaptable, and we know from the research that there is not a direct correlation between what you see on a scan and how someone is feeling, performing functionally. So, they did a study on the MRI findings of people's backs, and they found that there were degenerative changes to the spine in 16-year-olds.
Yeah.
And again, they've done shoulders on, they've done, again, similar studies on the shoulders of people, and they found that over 62% of people have had rotator cuff tears, but they haven't known about it at all. So I think we've got to take that into the context that things like imaging, like MRI scans, etc. It is one piece of the jigsaw. And also when we think about surgery, there is no guarantee that if you change a structure that it's going to take away your pain, because pain has multiple facets and components to it, including your psychology. So there's no guarantee that if you have surgery somewhere that it's going to take away the pain that you're experiencing. So I would say that surgery would be one of your last resorts in some circumstances. Now, the difference being, the only caveat to that is if we know that there is a structural pathology that is really causing, like driving that issue, and it's very obvious. So an example would be in the knee, for example, you can have something called what's called a bucket handle tear of your meniscus. So your meniscus is the cartilage around, underneath the knee. And sometimes you can have a tear in that meniscus that is just flapping around. And sometimes that won't respond to exercises. And so in that situation, yes, that is where surgery probably has to be the main thing. Whereas you might, on the other side of the coin, you might have a meniscus tear, but it's not necessarily causing kind of a block to movement, or it's not causing drastic symptoms. And actually with the right exercise and the right rehabilitation, that is going to respond, the pain is going to improve, and you can go about your daily life without any issues. So I think it's about first having clear assessment, trying kind of that more conservative management for a good period of time. So that would be from anywhere, I would say normally that kind of 2 to 3 months initially of kind of that conservative management side of things. And then if there's nothing changing, then I would probably be more on the side of, okay, actually, let's get a second assessment. Let's maybe look at some other investigations so we can get a more holistic picture of what's going on. And then you can start to move forwards, and in collaboration with the patient, the whole medical team and support team, you made that decision together. And that's something that's really important.
That is very, very interesting and also very insightful, I think. Especially, I have, at least that's also here my assumption, if I'm already clueless about most of the things that you've been talking about, Mike, and I am a practitioner when it comes to being a personal trainer and coaching people through several different things. And if I'm not even clued up about this, I would very much assume that many, many people who are listening to our podcast don't really know much about it either.
But do you know what? That's why we're here. That, it's to, people shouldn't expect to know these things, and we're still finding out new things, and there's a lot of information that has been passed down through society, through culture, etc. And I think that just again it creates misunderstanding about what's needed, and I think it's just about understanding that. Again, it's why it's so important that if you're able to find someone who has that kind of knowledge, that expertise, and that skills, it's invaluable. Even if you just have one session and you're like we've just done, we've been able to kind of, come to a better understanding. It just balances your approach out so much. And that's why it's worth the investment. People, again, it's not about necessarily, parting with your money for, in numerous sessions. Even if you have just invest your time in that one session, you're gonna have that information for life that's going to help you multiple times down the road. So I think that just investment is really useful for sure.
No, 100%. And one last question then, Mike, and that is, in your personal opinion and also, of course, professional expertise, would you recommend for the vast majority of people of doing more for their mobility and flexibility, simply because the vast majority of Western society may not be as flexible as the body wants them to?
Well, do you know what? I would actually say if people have enough range of movement to do the things that they want to be able to do. So if they can, if they can bend down, put their shoes on, or if they can do the activities and hobbies that they need to do with no pain, full range of movement, hey, they are fine. And just sometimes just performing the activities in and of themselves through their full range of movement is enough to increase but also maintain those that range of movement. So for example, again, if you wanted to kind of squat down to pick something up from the floor, literally just performing that squat motion is enough. It doesn't have to be a formal stretch or mobility. So I think people first need to ask that question of themselves. Now this will change, and this is something that I kind of wanted to ask you, because and you can tell me this, Pascal, but say 5 to 10 years ago, were you still snowboarding regularly, and were you doing the same hobbies that you are now with your family?
No. I was even, I would say, more active because I needed to commute to work and back again on my bicycle. And ever since I'm living outside, so slightly outside of Berlin, I'm not really riding my bicycle that much anymore. And I would I'm walking more, that's for sure, but I would assume that just like this pedaling and being a little bit more active, first and foremost, it very much decreased my energy expenditure because I'm not commuting it anymore. But also secondary, that motion is a little bit of a different one to what it is that you're usually doing throughout the day. And perhaps this also had a little bit of an impact on how things developed over the past years now.
Yeah. And I think that's the key thing. So over someone's lifetime, you're probably, if you change activities, lifestyle, sports, you might need to then incorporate some mobility work to then be able to do that activity. Either way. So kind of coming back to your example of, you move fine in the gym, you've got no problems with squatting. But actually, when it comes to some other movements, whether you're kind of skiing, snowboarding, or cycling, for example, actually, because that's a relatively new or it's a different activity, we now need to start incorporating some different kinds of mobility. So I think, again, if someone decides, actually, I want to take up a new sport, but I don't have the necessary flexibility or mobility to be able to do that, hey, now we need to change what we do. And finally, I think something we've obviously been talking a lot about the context of more static stretching. And what we've always got to realize is that stretching is a tool. It's not good, it's not bad, it's just a tool. And there are other people don't have to do like a static stretching session. Literally, you can do weighted stretching. You can literally do, there are just lots of forms of mobility which might more align with some people than others. So I think it's just that, again, it's not the tool, it's the context and how you think about utilizing that tool, because a tool used in the right situation is gold, but in the wrong situation, it's useless.
I find it very, very cool that you're bringing this up, because this brings me to another thought of mine. And that is, are there any kind of small tricks and hacks that you can incorporate throughout the day to improve your general kind of mobility and just, I don't know, awareness of your body? Just as an example, I was buying some skiing boots over on holiday, and that guy, he is skiing since like, I don't know, 25, 30 years, something like this. And he said he's even brushing his teeth whenever while standing on one foot or one leg. Mm-hmm. Something like this. So you're brushing your teeth anyway. It doesn't require a lot of your focus and attention, and potentially there's some benefit to it while doing something like this. Can you think of certain kind of tips, tricks, hacks that anyone can easily implement and would benefit from?
So I guess because we're on the topic of mobility, that could be something. So have you heard of hold relax stretches, or people call it PNF stretches, neuromuscular facilitation
I've
stretches?
heard it on one of the Tom Merrick stretches where he's actively pressing into something while stretching.
Exactly. So basically PNF stretching or hold relax stretching is where you contract the muscle maximally or quite hard for, say, like anywhere from 3 to 6 seconds. You'll then, because you've had a maximum contraction, you'll get a maximum relaxation of the muscle. So it allows you to sink into the stretch a little bit more. So what you could do, again, the best thing that you can do is just say you're working by a desk. Maybe that might mean, okay, you're going to stand up from your desk. You're going to kind of put your foot up onto a chair or a stool and kind of stretch the hamstring, but then you're going to push your heel down into the stool and then kind of sink into the hamstring stretch a little bit deeper, and then kind of repeat that maybe 3 to 5 times. So that's something that's really quick that might kind of help. The other thing in terms of a hack is, again, going back to Eric Helms's kind of study. If you're, again, like yourself, Pascal, where you're kind of working from home, maybe what you could do is you could just put on, like, say, some sort of stretching or orthotic device that puts your calves in a really stretched position. You work by your desk for like an hour or 2 hours, and then you kind of, and that's a great way. The only disadvantage with that could be if it's so uncomfortable that it's distracting from your work, then that might always be helpful. But, again, it's just those sorts of things. And then the final thing I would say is change your position. So again, what they've shown in the research now is that there is no right or wrong posture. It's, there is no right or wrong posture, but it's that we're changing our positions regularly throughout the day. We're not sitting down for 6 to 8 hours. We're regularly changing our positions, every kind of half an hour or an hour. So what I would say to someone, again, maybe someone like yourself, Pascal, is, okay, maybe you can sit for an hour or two, maybe you can stand for an hour or two, maybe you can squat for an hour or two, and you can just sit in a squat position for 3 to 5 minutes. Man, your squat mobility, I know you don't need to work on your squat mobility, but someone else who struggles with it.
I mean, when I'm in a squat position, like at home or so, I can definitely feel a little bit more tension in my left hip. But it's something that I don't really notice whenever I'm squatting, for example. So I could probably benefit from something like this as well.
So that would be amazing. And again, like, if you were to, you could incorporate things like, something weighted. So again, what you can do is you can say, again, in yourself, Pascal, your study is kind of near your staircase. You could then hop around your staircase, do like kind of 10 calf raises, and then just hold that calf stretch position for however long you wanted to for a few minutes. Again, maybe whilst you're, doing some work on your phone or making a social media post or whatever. So again, those are probably 3 or 4 things that people could easily do. And again, it will stack. So it might mean for someone who does something like that, you don't need someone like that. You might not need to do half an hour of stretching in the evening. If you've done that 5 or 6 times a day, before you know it, you've accumulated probably over 3 to 5 minutes of stretching that day. Boom, you've done it. So, and that's what I often say to patients when I'm with them in the clinic. If they're struggling to do the exercises, I say to them, be opportunistic, right? Where can we combine things? So maybe you're kind of in the car and we can do some neck exercises. Maybe you're kind of, you've got a band underneath your desk, etc. So it's just about finding those opportunities during the day that don't take time away, but you can just kind of be more efficient.
This brings me to the last question, because we're also coming up on time, Mike.
Yeah.
Crazy to think that it has been an hour already. And that is, do you think that anyone can accomplish or get into some kind of range of motion that is impressive? So you know what it is that I'm talking about. Something like a very much ass to grass squat, a body weighted, for example, without any kind of wedges underneath the heels. Do you think that anyone can get to that position if they are just working long enough for something like this?
Again, I probably couldn't say in absolute terms for absolutely everybody, because everyone's going to have a different structure, and some people might have certain injuries, which just makes it impossible. So, for example, if someone's had a fusion of their ankle joint, of course, they're going to be limited. But I would say in the vast majority of the healthy population, most people can achieve that. But what the mistake people make is they don't give themselves long enough. They think, oh, I should be able to do that in a month, 2 months, 6 months. No, you've got to think in terms of years. Again, there's that quote by Tony Robbins, which says people often overestimate what they can do in a year, but they underestimate what they can do in 10 years. And I think it's about playing the long game, not having realistic expectations in the short term, but don't underestimate yourself of what you can achieve in the long term. And actually in 5-10 years, you can totally transform and revolutionize your movement patterns, your body. We see this all the time. We see people who go from rugby men, strong men to ultra endurance athletes, and their body changes. So the body is an adaptation machine. And I really think for the vast majority of people that, again, that anything is possible is true.
No, perfect. That's exactly what I wanted to hear, because then I am able to continue my education around becoming a yoga teacher and then opening up my yoga studio at some point.
Well,
Perfect.
I can totally see it.
So, Mike, it was a pleasure, and thank you very much for the very insightful podcast. Because I couldn't really recall if I've ever listened to a podcast in our kind of realm where they've very much went deep into the topic around stretching and mobility to that extent, and not just like the supple leopard or anything alike. So thank you very much for taking the time educating us around the topic of stretching, mobility, and I really do hope that people were able to take a lot away from this. Is there anything that you want to let the people know, or any last words?
It's really just, again, it's all about how we think about things. So it's so easy to brandish something as, oh, that's good, that's bad. No. And we see this by the research that always comes out. Sometimes the research will show, oh, this wasn't helpful. And so we all say, oh, stretching is useless or stretching is bad. And then actually new research findings come out and it turns out to be the opposite. And we're like, oh no, stretching is actually good. And I think, remember, to quote a Stoic, a Stoic quote, nothing is, well, I think it's Shakespeare actually, nothing is good or bad, only thinking makes it so. And I think it's all about, remember that everything is a tool. Think about what's the context in which you're using it, and then go from there. And again, sometimes if you don't know, you're probably better off going to someone who can help you get clarity on that. And then you're going to get to where you need to go a lot faster. So yeah, I would just say to people, just think about things. Don't think of things as black and white, absolute statements. Just think about everything as a tool. What's the context that I need to use this, or that this could be helpful, and then move forwards from there.
That was perfect. So thank you very much, Mike, for taking the time. And I guess we will talk to you soon. Cheers.
Hell yeah. See you later, guys.
Losing weight fast while maintaining muscle mass. Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? It isn't though. It's reality, and we know how to do it, and we will help you achieve this. The Minicut movement is an 8-week fat loss program to make you lose a huge chunk of fat while maintaining muscle mass at the same time. We will support you from the beginning to the end so that you see the results you would like to and come out of it much stronger. You'll receive a fully automated spreadsheet that is based on your nutritional needs. You can choose between 6 different male and female training templates. Over 30 videos will guide you through each and every single step of the Minicut so that you're getting the most out of your journey and that you always know what to do. But the best thing is that you can start whenever you want. The Minicut movement is open 24/7. So if you want to learn more or you're ready to sign up, hit the link in the description below. So let's revive stronger together.